second edition of the Lord Biennale's Closing Academic Forum. So this has been a really exciting week of talks on film, on art, politics, and literature from around the world, but with a really nice focus on Pakistan and with a focus on the themes and issues that were raised in the works in the show. So we're very happy to be here today for a panel on cinema with these three wonderful, more than qualified individuals. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing them because each of them will talk about their own work, but our own LDF's own Amina Beal will be moderating this panel. Himself has much to say, but on the panel is Gwen Kirk, who is an assistant professor at London University in Lahore in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Momin Masood, who's a lecturer at Punjab University, and David Ahmed, who is also a professor at LUMS. And so we're really looking forward to what they have to say today on Pakistani cinema and cinema beyond. So thank you all for joining us. After this talk, there are two more talks. Nidika Singh and John Tain will be joining us to give their own lectures. And later on tonight, buses will go from NCA to Model Town for a book launch at Rotas, which is a collateral event of the second World Biennale. So we hope you can join us for that as well. But thank you, and I will let our panelists begin.
Cinephilia in Pakistan, Beyond Death and the Bible. And those of you with an interest in cinema, maybe we don't even have an interest in cinema, will have come across this talk of the Pakistani film industry dying and being undergoing revival, right? This is a kind of narrative that we've heard repeated quite a lot in journalistic discourse and probably in drawing rooms and conversations that we have with people. So perhaps we could begin by, the purpose of the panel is to sort of unpack this existing conversation about Pakistani cinema and see if we can find a way that's a little bit, find a pathway that's a bit deeper, a bit more interesting, and a bit more complex than the existing frameworks of analysis that we have. So perhaps we could go by the order that we're sitting in and just get your initial thoughts, each of you, on this existing discourse and what you think may be useful or not so useful about the way that we talk about cinema in Pakistan.
Well, I want to, first of all, I just want to thank LDF for having us and CU for hosting and just being part of all the wonderful events. I think we've had a great time seeing all the different exhibits, and of course the film installations are particularly exciting, but it's just been a wonderful setup, so just want to get that out of the way. I also think I should leave most of the talk on revival to my friends here. I know. But I really want to talk about the idea of death and decline in Pakistani cinema. And to my mind, there are two major issues with the discourse of a death or a decline or a zawal, as they call it. The first one being that if you look at the chronology of the supposed zawal, it takes place after 71, right? And really accelerates in the 80s and into the 90s. And most mainstream narratives of decline, the kind of Sultan Rahi era is really considered this degenerate moment in cinema and this kind of decadent sort of thing. Whereas the Wahid Murad Urdu films of the 60s are sort of the high point, right? And I'm not the only person who has problematized this. But there's obviously a class dynamic that really informs that judgment, right? That it's very much a top-down view of it's very much a top-down view of a cinema that kind of becomes increasingly proletarian and increasingly representative of a more specific kind of ethno-linguistic block, let's say. So there's that. And I don't want to also just say that Punjabi cinema is representative of, you know, all Punjabis or only Punjabis. Like, we can pick that apart for days, and that's fine, we should. But that's one issue. The other issue is, when I started doing research, and by training I'm not a film scholar at all. I'm a linguistic anthropologist. Okay. I'm also not trained in the use of microphones, so I don't know what's going on right now. So the other issue was, for me, when I came to Pakistan and I was interested in essentially ethno-linguistic identity formations and their connection with aesthetics in cinema. So when I went to Evernew Studios, and I was told by everybody that, you know, abhi film nahi ban rahi, and, you know, there's no filmmaking happening, and it's all slowed to a halt, and but I had kind of suspicions because films were being released and you could find evidence of this in advertisements and things. So I went to Evernew Studios, and I found that film ban rahi, you know, so this idea that it had all ended or that it had totally shut down was just really not true. But instead it was reinforcing that, again, that hegemony that a certain kind of urbane middle-class Urdu cinema perhaps had ended. But not all cinema had ended. And I mean, I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll pass it along.
I think this is a great jumping off point to what my work is, because I focus on post-70s cinema, post-AR cinema, and I try to theorize it from the framework of cult and exploitation film. So cult films are films that usually invite very dedicated fan bases, films that we see a lot, multiple times, are cult films. So cult can be a genre, but it can also be a legacy. Films can be cult or they can become cult. And I was very interested in American cult films, and I wanted to understand if we can theorize Pakistani post-AR cinema from a cult perspective. And I looked at this period of decline because, sure, there is a decline. I would say, yes, death happens, but of a certain mainstream kind of cinema. But because of that, alternative cinemas are born. Because of the industry dynamics at that point, the precarity of filmmaking, exhibition, reception, there are certain films that, because of the way the industry was at that time, certain forms of alternative cinemas were sort of originating at that point. How do we talk about those films? Because they are positioned against the mainstream, but then there are audiences who are flocking to the cinemas who are still going to watch those films. So I'm primarily interested with reception. How the people who would go to the cinema again and again to watch Mola Jat, knowing that, you know, the cinemas could be raided at any time. How do we theorize that sort of reception? Because it's not just that films were being made. Now there's a specific kind of film, a very unique film that emerged. And again, it's not to, sure, I would say my kind of research is an act of historical revisionism to say that, well, cinema didn't just decline, it also fashioned these other forms of filmmaking and consumption as well. And also the class factor, because cult films, the way they're theorized in a way of minority resistance, that this is a kind of culture that is deliberately positioned against a more mainstream form of filmmaking. So how can we talk about post-70s cinema from the perspective of resistance, those who are going to the films, engaging with the media, speaking back to the screen, knowing that these films, and some of these films were highly political and transgressive. Again, my entry into Pakistani film was also from a queer perspective. I wanted to know if, you know, we had any form of queer engagement with cinema, especially from an audience perspective. Can we think of, or are there any evidences of trans participation in cinema spaces? Because there is work here and there about how trans women would navigate cinema spaces during and after Zia. So that was kind of what my entry point into film was, and the kind of work that I aim to do. I again don't have a film degree and I'm not an expert or anything, but the kind of work that I aim to be doing in the future is to think about, because what cult gives us, it gives us this freedom to imagine or sort of reimagine alternative forms of cinema and the engagement with cinema. That again, it doesn't have to be sort of, what can I say? It's not reclaiming anything, but it's sort of to understand that, well, there were people who were watching these films and people who were making these films, and at a particular historical moment we had this new form of cinema and what we can call it. Again, calling these films cult films is also problematic because we get this language from American cult films. We get this from a very, again, unique phenomenon in the US in the 60s, the midnight movies, and the people who would go watch them and who would then label them as cult films. And there was this idea of ironic spectatorship. So people will go watch these films because they were so bad that they were entertaining, the way we would perhaps now watch older Pakistani films because they're so bad and they're so trash and quiche, and that's our, and I'm very aware of this space as well, of how we talk about Senegalese cinema, especially. I mean, we can't leave out class from any space. So, especially the discourse that came up with the revival, with the remake of Maula Jat as well. All those things, class is very important. And so it's hard to use the framework of cult because cult, the original discourse is deeply embedded with these class dynamics. American cult audiences were very male, very bourgeois, very cishet. But the people here, the people who were going to watch Maula Jat were working class people who were not watching it ironically, but they were actually, it was a moment of political catharsis or resistance for them. So again, this is very tricky to sort of talk about cult films here in Pakistan using the grammar, using the vocabulary of cult. So we really need a new theory. That's kind of, I think, the kind of work we need to do in Pakistani cinema is probably look for early Pakistani film criticism, or how do we think of genre, or how do we think of, because whenever the kind of work that has been coming from Pakistan in the last 10 or something years, it's always been, well, this film is an art horror film, or this is a film noir. We kind of end up going back to Western film theory and language to imagine the kind of films that we made, or the modes of exhibition and reception especially. So the kind of work that I think is very necessary and we can do is maybe re-theorize or come up with a new language to talk about Pakistani film. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this.
I find Momna's work really interesting. I think cult and queer cinema is something we really need to explore in not wanting to use the language. But I actually don't have as much of a problem right now. I did have much bigger problem with the words death and revival earlier, but now my bigger problem is with the word cinema, because it's singular. And it suggests that there is only one cinema, and there's always been one cinema in Pakistan. And I think by doing that, you have to use words like death and revival and decline and so on, because there's a narrative there. So I think for me, the real issue is that it's cinemas, and this is something Gwen and I have worked on a lot. So it's also a way that for us to not fight or kill each other is disagree on the word cinemas. So, you talk about your cinema, I'll talk about mine. So, and then revival, because my work is on new Pakistani cinema after 2013 and digital cinema in particular. So there's no way that that's a revival. It's a completely different cinema altogether, technology-wise, narratives-wise, everything is different. The people, the audience, everything is different. So it's an urban digital cinema, and therefore we assume that if it's a revival, then there is only an urban digital cinema, an urban digital audience, and therefore we don't have a rural audience or a small town audience or an audience of any other cinema. So I think there is, if you bring in queer cinema or cult cinema or Punjabi action cinema or the Urdu social or melodrama, or there's so many different types of cinemas existing. So I think if we change our conversation to that on Pakistani cinemas versus cinema, I think that would definitely help create a more holistic and a deeper conversation. So.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really useful place to begin our conversation about your individual researches, and I understand your teaching as well, right? Because at least two of you are teaching cinema here. You're also teaching as well. Okay, so you have a good sense of how young people interact with and perceive, cinema, and what kinds of cinephilia and love of cinema exist in Pakistan today. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how your experiences in the classroom and how what you've learned about the way cinema is perceived, and what sort of fertile areas there may be for exploration and engagement with young people on this question.
Yeah, I really feel like I should share this with Zewanissa. We, starting last year, we've been teaching a research seminar in screen studies. We're trying to push our students to also work on dramas and YouTube videos and things. But we essentially guide students over a semester in doing directed research projects on different aspects. And most of the students, alums, do not have that many film courses. There's a few, so some of the students have a little introduction to film, but very few are familiar with, for example, Pakistani cinema history. Very few will have seen a Pakistani movie, or they may have seen one or two of the newer films, but even that's kind of rare, which I think also has to do, again, with the class background of our students, and the relative coolness of Netflix versus Punjabi Jangi or something, right? So, yeah, and capacity to download things. So, they're seeing a lot of these films with extremely fresh eyes, but then the kinds of topics that they pick, I think we love it because a lot of the research is things we would love to study ourselves, but we don't have time to write that many papers. So we had a student this past semester who was working on Siraiki telefilms, and he did an amazing research and ended up working with some of the filmmakers and things, which is a genre that has not been written on in academic, in any academic or non-academic publication that I know of, right? We have students exploring these kind of cult dimensions. There was a student who did an amazing paper on the female body in Hasina Atom Bomb, right? And I mean, we've had actually this paper on item numbers. We had a student do a paper on item numbers in movies made in Lahore in the 1940s, pre-partition. So I mean, there's just like really incredible kind of things that they're so creative, I think, because they're seeing it in such a fresh way. They're not informed by decades and decades of seeing these films, or even that narrative that I think a lot of people maybe our age have of decline and revival and this kind of thing. I think they're not even that familiar with that. Right? Do you want to add, Melissa?
Actually, can we show realpakistan.com, lums. We don't have a .com, yeah. But I know the history of film students here, or film history students. So this is just, we want to... So we just launched this day before yesterday, and from next semester we're opening it up. We're going to open it up to students from all over, and scholars all over. This is a film journal for young scholars such as yourself. So we really do encourage you to.
If you're doing any work on Pakistani screen cultures,
yes, please submit it. So this is where we publish volume 1. So.
can you click on volume 1?
So coming back to what Gwen said, we've had some very interesting, I think one of the biggest issues I've had is, I teach, from film mechanics to Pakistani cinema to new Pakistani cinema to, I don't know what I'm teaching, gender and urban screen narratives, is that when you tell the class, okay, it's going to be a black and white silent film, you said then you have to make sure that you don't tell them before, so they actually show up to class, because if you say that, they just won't come to class the next day. So you have to surprise them and say, we're going to watch, Spider-Man. And then, I think, surprise, it's a film from 1941. And then having them sit through it, not allowing them to go to the bathroom or go to sleep, and locking the door and forcing them to watch it. And then seeing them suddenly wake up and their eyes open and realize, wow, there's actually so much going on. And I think that's something that I've enjoyed. It's been fun to torture them while also educating them, because forms of torture are less for teachers these days. So that's one thing, and I think the other thing is a lot of interest in filmmaking, which we're trying to, in London, we're going to start a filmmaking course, but I think there's so much interest in film and cinema and screen studies in Pakistan right now, and it needs to be tapped into, and there's just not enough quality education in it. And there's not enough often letting people know that you don't have to do an entire degree in film to be a filmmaker. And so I think that's the main thing about teaching film right now, is that you also have to fight to teach it, because you have to show that it is actually something that's viable to offer and to do, but also that you don't have to go to a fancy film school to be good at film or study film.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer this question because I don't teach film, and so I don't really have that experience. I think, but being on the other end, I'm still very fresh out of my MPhil, so being on the other end of studying film on your own, I think one of the things that we would need, probably people like you, I wish I'd taken your class, probably navigating film would have been easier. So yeah, I think that's all I can say on this.
Thanks. Just wondering if I might add an experience of my own when I was teaching film here. This is before the sort of revival, so-called revival of 2013, 2009. I don't know if you agree or you've had similar experiences. It's quite different maybe now, but back then, when you talked about cinema to people, actually they thought it was like a bad thing. Meaning, like, if you mentioned it, it was like somehow sordid or something, because the cinema had become, as it has been in different, I don't know if you agree, in different parts of the world, it has a history of taboo attached to it, and somehow for various historical reasons, I don't know if you agree, but I would say that sort of Cinephilia, that rather than Cinephilia, is actually quite a pronounced thing in Pakistan. I don't know if any of you would want to pick up on that or agree or disagree or.
I'm sure we've all experienced this in our research, but I remember when I was doing my fieldwork the first time here, and I'm not from Pakistan, so it was very new to me, screen cultures and cinema going culture and things. So, I had made a pretty good friend who was teaching at BNU at the time, and he said, "Hey, I'm gonna go to the cinema." It was because I think it was when Bar was coming out, and I was trying to get her to come see Bar with me, which wasn't even so we're not talking about going to Lakshmi Chowk or something. We were gonna go to Sozo or like a slightly more upscale cinema, and she got kind of cold, and she said, "Aaj tak meri family mein koi aur cinema nahi gayi." I was like, okay. So she had a very strong reaction, and obviously that's not everyone's experience and that's not everybody's position. But that strong undercurrent, or even just the fact of doing research on cinema, and you often get a blank stare. Why? Why would you bother to do this? You do research, anyone can use it. So that reaction has come out a lot as well.
I think I can share that sentiment. Doing my own MPhil thesis was on Pakistani horror cinema, so I focused on Zinda Lash and Zabahana, and from sort of a queer perspective, really. And the reaction of my chair was that, this is research, I can't really say anything about it, but these aren't good films to sort of work on. Like, who works on these films? And even my external examiner was like, why did you choose, okay, we know about Zinda Lash, but what's Zabahana? Nobody's seen it, like, why would you want to work on this? And so you're always in this position of defending the films and the cinema you're working on, that there is something there to research. But also this thing of the cinephobia attached to just going to the cinema. Cinema going is always, and has been since, I think Zia, has had this sort of this identity attached to it as something that is immoral and un-Islamic something that is not, does not come, if you're a respectable upper middle class person, you're not, especially if you're a woman, you're not going to go to these Awami cinemas especially. So that is something that I was also interested in, collecting testimonies of women who did actually go and how they navigated cinema spaces back then when it was considered to be precarious and immoral and when all that baggage was and taboo was associated to it. So I think that's something that we can maybe look into even more, how just occupying a cinema space, belonging to a certain identity can be, because, and this is something that I've experienced last year, and I have a piece in Dawn about this, watching Bohemian Rhapsody in Lahore, when Bohemian Rhapsody came out. And it was a really interesting time because I watched it in Lahore at Fortress. And being a queer, sort of lower middle class woman, difficulties of mobility, of moving around on your own, all that concerning, all that sort of set aside. But this was the day after they were protests by the TLP and the war was shut down. And the day it opened, Bohemian Rhapsody was playing. And I went and watched it. So this is the day after Lahore opens up, after these protests of these fundamentalist Islamic groups who've occupied the city, and to then navigate, to actually go to the cinema and watch a film like that, felt sort of a very emotional experience. And I think those are the kind of narratives that we can maybe bring our own identity in, because I think film studies allows us that sort of room to explore our own identities as spectators and as participants. So I think that's something that we can probably, students can look more into.
I love that piece. I loved your piece. In fact, I saw Bohemian Rhapsody and then I assigned that piece to my students. And then they all went and saw the film. So that was a really good piece. I remember that. I'm embarrassed to talk about my MPhil because I heard about my title actually says the rise and fall of Pakistani cinema. So I disowned my MPhil. But I was also directed through it. So I was told, mostly to these 5 people, they write this. And I wanted to get it done, so I said, okay. But I guess I'm the only film studies, I'm the only one with film degree, so I think my parents probably, yes, Mama's going to get her film degree. But I think my parents probably had that when I first went, and everybody said, why would you study film? And I remember when I was writing my first chapter and I was going in for my field work, my field work literally was, I want to go see if something is happening. And they said, well, what would you do if nothing's happening? I said, I'll write about why nothing's happening, but I'm sure something is happening. And something's always happening, right? So and then at that time, everybody in Pakistan would say to me, why are you studying film? Why are you studying film? And what really upset me is that when I got done, everybody was doing film. And they're like, oh, this is so great. I wish I could have recorded people because I want to feel that I felt horrible about it, and I was really upset so many people had gone into film and stolen my thunder. By the time I came back, but that's what happens when you do a PhD, you're away for so many years, you come back and everybody's making a film. So I think as far as that's concerned, there was this big, and I was teaching at PNU before, and over there was this big thing of people who were in film or television or media. And again, oftentimes it's women, it's girls, and either allowed to do it at that time till they get married, study that. It wasn't considered a career for men because they wouldn't be able to support their families, and they would, there'd always be, the boys would be outnumbered in class. And I think these kinds of things, just in the education of film, you're reflecting, so you're talking about people who have reached a point of getting their undergraduate or graduate degrees. If they're thinking about it like this, then, well, obviously what's the general audience thinking? And then just going to a cinema and seeing, I remember going to cinemas when I was younger and having to sit in that box and then being taken out 15 minutes inside into the film, realizing it's just not appropriate for like a 7-year-old because the first dance came on. But then going 10, whatever, how many years later to see, what was it? It was the first 2000, why am I blanking? Khuda Ke Liye. and everybody just loving the audience reaction to Khuda Ke Liye. Because we have, our audience also has to whistle at everything and laugh at everything and clap at everything, which is great, sometimes inappropriately, but great as well. And at that time, Nasiruddin Shah, everybody got up and started clapping after Nasiruddin Shah's big. So it was a very participative audience as well. So they'll boo you as well as applaud you, which is, and I think that can cause anxiety among women as well when the audience gets very rowdy and deep in your families. So it's a very murky space. I mean, sometimes they whistle during the national anthem. That's got that as well.
Thank you. Perhaps we could move into a more a sort of in-depth discussion of some of the specific research that you've each been doing. And it's going to get a bit eclectic because I think you work on different things. And I think we might just go through you one by one to talk. And I'll ask you about something. I was just going to say, why don't we also show at this moment some clips as well? And if you want to start with a clip, that's also fine.
I have a short paper that I'm working on looking at kind of looking at drag and kind of potentially queer moments. So it kind of overlaps with Momina's work as well. I think Momina could talk a lot about Kakewali. But I'm looking at this and a few other films. But this is one of Musarrat Nazir's first films. It's from I think '56, and in this film she plays a village girl who's had a lot of tragedy in her life, and her job is driving a horse cart. She has to come to Lahore because of all the tragedy in her life, and so she continues to do her job, but because women aren't allowed to do this in Lahore, she has to dress as a man. So she spends about a third of the movie kind of in drag as a cart driver.
It's really interesting,
But it's
gender and queerness and exaltation.
And it's not just necessarily her occupying the male space, but it's also her occupying the city space. So, and encountering different other, again, it's so her Punjabi identity is being juxtaposed with other regional identities, not in the way that you would expect looking at Pakistani cinema now. So there's kind of some very interesting things there. So I'll let Zayman start.
बाबूजी ये कच्चे क्यों है
ओ भाई इतने साढ़े वर्ग रईस बंदे चौड़ होना
yes no nonsense yes बाबूजी ये कच्चे क्यों है
ओ भाई इतने साढ़े वर्ग रईस बंदे चौड़ होना
अच्छा चलो फिर आज अस्सी भी चाड़ोगे बेचने
और नहीं ना तू नहीं अंदर जा सकता
क्यों
ऐसे सिर्फ सूट बूट वाले जाते ने या फिर जिन्ना साढ़े वर्ग के कपड़े पाए नाल बंदे को थोड़ी जिनी यस नो भी आनी चाहिए आओ
yes no yes no yes Please have a seat. Yes. Have a cup of tea? No. Coffee? Yes. What? Yes, no, yes, no. No? Nonsense. Yes, yes.
साफ whiskey
Yes, yes.
soda
Oh no.
water
Yes, yes. ਜਿਹਦੇ ਲਈ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਈ ਹਾਂ ਉਹ ਤੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਦਿਸਦਾ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ Oh, you fool!
We can come back to that song in a bit. But there's so much. I don't know if you saw when she's coming out. There's that outline of a woman's body shape, which is completely different from what you end up seeing. But and the jazz band. But that imagery. So you have to think this is 1957, and you were thinking about this idea of the post-colonial space. This very much this. The impact or the impact of the British, the English, the language, the cult. The earlier you have her being almost, she's basically not molested, that's not felt up by a woman who said that she's not man enough. So you also have this, the body is very much part of this frame. And what I find fascinating about that is, these are spaces that were actually people were not allowed due to class or gender. But within it as well, the women are playing very much a role of the entertainer, whether it's offering you coffee or tea, or sitting next to you, or dancing for you. But the woman dancing for you is not the same woman who's sitting with you. So the women sitting with you, they're wearing dresses, they can speak proper English and so on. But the woman dancing for you is very much this exotified Punjab idea of Punjab.
And then she sees herself in that image.
Yes, and she sees herself in that image. And for me, one of the most interesting parts of for me work-wise is I always tell my students you're going to hate film after taking class with me because we go into such details about this. But for me, the most interesting point is the actual the way you occupy. We talked about this as well. Occupy space, and who has right over space and ownership of space. And you can really tell about what is happening within a country and its imagination and so on by how people occupy space in its cinema at a particular time. So I think that's why this particular clip is fascinating for me.
Yeah, and it's always fun watching things with you because I'm coming at it. I was really interested in the idea of vocal drag and vocal drag in more recent Punjabi cinema. So you have actresses like earlier on Asya or Anjuman, and then later on Saima, who do wo badke marti hain the way men do, right? They have this kind of yelling and this verbal dueling thing. So I was kind of approaching it from
Thanks very much. Before we move on to the Momna's clip, which we're going to show the trailer, right, for that film, and I just maybe just like to point out that Gwen's done some really amazing, interesting research on the importance of dialogue in Punjabi cinema, and I haven't seen that work done. But she also, in 2013, she did field work on a Punjabi film set, and that's like the only ethnography I know where someone's actually hung out seriously, spent serious time on a film set. And it was very interesting for me to learn about just how important dialogue is. And I'm one of those Punjabi origin people who don't really speak. I understand it from home life, but don't speak it. So Gwen does speak it, I understand. So maybe we can persuade her to give us some more Jat lines later on if we can. So yeah, maybe you could speak. I mean, either we move straight on to Morna's clip and you talk about language later, or would you want to say a word about it now in relation to this? Yeah, that'd be great.
I think we all have things to say about it. It's amazing film. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and so my primary interest, in fact, in Punjabi cinema was linguistic, because Punjabi is essentially a marginalized language of a not marginalized people, right? And it's kind of this paradoxical thing. So most of the research that's done on language ideology and language politics really revolves around marginalized groups and their languages. So this was kind of an interesting exception in the case of Punjabi. And film for me became a place where I didn't start out, I was always interested in film, but I didn't really start out looking to study cinema or film as part of my research, proper linguistic anthropology research. So for me, film became that place where a lot of the anxieties around Punjabi language were not just kind of distilled, but also positively reappropriated. So on the one hand, you have the ideology that says Punjabi is, it's a crude language, it's loud. The first thing people will tell you about Punjabi, if you're doing research on Punjabi, is that it's loud. It's a very loud language. Right? What does that even mean? Right? Obviously, this is an ideology, and not, there's no kind of linguistic property of Punjabi that makes it necessarily louder than any other language. But these are the things that are emphasized in cinema. The connection between language and masculinity in things like verbal dueling. People think of Punjabi cinema as a very violent cinema, and I'm not saying that it's not, but a lot of the violence is linguistic and verbal, and takes place through, shouting brawls, right? No, I'm good. I think we all know the lines. Yeah. Maybe angry.
Okay, all right.
No, we were probably not. And then when I started looking very closely at the language, and I won't bore you with too many of these details, but as a linguist, this was also very interesting to me, is that you could actually see things like dialect leveling going on. So the Punjabi of the screen, when I came here to do research, I figured these films are being made in Lahore. The kind of Punjabi that's in the films will be some kind of Lahori Punjabi. And it is, but it also isn't. Care is taken during the making of the film to kind of create this Punjabi register, or sort of an idealized dialect of a kind of Punjab of nowhere. So it's not, the Punjabi on screen is not really identifiable as like, oh, this is like, these people are from Gujranwala, or this person is from, Okara, or whatever it is. But in fact, there's this kind of geographic bleaching that goes on. So again, I won't bore you, but I could talk about pronominal analytics and future transformation and things if you really want. But I probably will stop there with the language. But for me, this was very interesting how on a micro level, linguistically, performances were being tailored to create this kind of vast and geographically non-specific idealized image of Punjab. That's my take.
Thank you very much. So let's hear from Mona about this film clip. Should we go straight into the clip, or do you want to speak a little bit? Maybe you introduce the clip while Haris is setting it up. Is that all right, Mona? And you could tell us about this amazing article that you've written in Bioscope, which I came across initially the abstract, and it looked really interesting, and that's how sort of tracked you down. It was amazing to see somebody doing this kind of work in Lahore. So very glad that we managed to get you here to tell us about this article. And while you do that, maybe Hara's going to... Is it queued up? So it's up to you. And if you want to go and get this... This is a trailer, right?
It's just a trailer of Zibahana. This came out in 2007 by Umar Ali Khan. It's a horror film basically. So.
Look, 5 hours and we'll be listening to the hottest band in Pakistan.
You are my whole world. You are my only. I live only for you.
कहाँ चल दिए बेशाम गले तो लखपुर का नाम नहीं सुना तुम्हारी तरह कितने बचे उस राह पर और लौट कर नहीं आए तो लखपुर
Basically, the story is that of any slasher film. You have a group of friends who are going to watch a rock concert and they get lost. Their van breaks down and then they get hunted by this masked killer. Her name is Baby, and my paper was to, and I first of all want to thank Ali and Gwen for writing their own pieces on Zibahana because that really gave me the jumping off point to sort of write my own piece. Again, the paper sort of was interrogating genre because this is a very deliberate take on the slasher film. Umar Ali Khan is a cinephile of his own right, so he's not just making a film, he's very he's deliberately trying to, it's a commentary on the slasher film genre. It's very melodic. And basically I wanted to see how the slasher film as a genre sort of is reimagined in Pakistan. And so the idea of a slasher film is that usually among a group of friends there is this one final girl who survives. So the idea of the slasher film is that you have a group of friends and the violence is survived by one woman called the final girl. And usually the person who is sort of performing the violence in American slasher films is a male, sort of cishet male body who's committing violence on sexualized female bodies. That's basically the logic of a slasher film. Here that sort of logic is reversed because the person committing the violence is a queer woman and the bodies who are being violated are these cishet, urban, bourgeois, sort of privileged bodies. So I thought that was really interesting because normally you don't have queer sort of characters or identities in this role of committing violence or in this role of resistance. Baby commits violence only on those who trespass or who enter her territory or who she sees as threats. She lives with a mother. Again, we don't see a patriarch. The family unit is very interesting. So there's Baby and her mother, and they have a brother who's a malang sort of, who's kind of lures people into their slaughterhouse, which is basically also a shrine. So the slaughterhouse serves as a shrine. It's very interesting. And the father, they keep his skeleton in the closet. So there's a lot of it's a heavily queer coded film for me. When I saw it, I thought it's a vision of, and that's what the title of my paper was, a vision of queer anarchism. Another interesting thing about American slasher films is that the final girl usually survives. Here she kind of doesn't. So at one level you have a masked, angry queer woman with a mace who's running after these sheher wale, and that's a very interesting word that they use, phrase that they use for their victims, kaum wale. So kaum wale are those who come from the cities, and so there's an interesting idea of citizenship as well, of who has claims to citizenship and how this particular family does not feel that they, sort of feels that the idea of a nation is something that does not include them, and so they are sort of fighting and resisting against normative citizenry, also this environmental terrorism, because one of the characters who gets murdered immediately after he is throwing up in a sort of water supply from where people get water. And so that's the last shot we see of him, and then there are zombies suddenly around him who sort of infect him. So there's a lot of stuff going on. My idea was to see Baby as sort of a violent queer agency who's trying to sort of not just reclaim her own space or protect her own space, but she's also trying to make this commentary on and again, this idea of representation, of queer representation, because in Pakistani cinema, queer representation that we all know of is when you have your token trans person who's sort of used as a comic relief. But here in Zibahana, the queer body is violent. It's highly eroticized as well. She wears a bloodied burqa, which I think it's very erotic, but again, we can have multiple readings of that. So yeah, that's kind of what the paper was and what it was trying to do. Again, apart from Baby, there are also zombies. So their zombies are, again, these rural people who have drunk, infected, polluted water, and now they're becoming zombies. But as they're zombies, they're also trying to convert other people, the normal people into zombies. So there's this, and the film ends with them, of them sort of moving into the city. We don't see them entering the city, but they're sort of just now slowly crawling out of it, and the threat has not been eliminated. Baby kind of dies, but the zombies are still there, and the final girl also kind of converts into one. So there's this idea of a queer future as well, that this is kind of what the film is envisioning, a queer future of sorts, of an alternative or sort of anti-normative ways of not just being and belonging. Again, the family unit is very interesting, with the father and the sign of patriarchy in the closet. I love that. But it's not just that, but also the fact that it doesn't kill its major source of horror. The violence is still there, even off screen, and it hasn't been resolved, because usually in slasher films, horror films result into the re-establishment of the status quo. Everything is fine, everything is under control, the source of horror is eliminated. Here it isn't. So I thought that was really interesting, how Pakistani horror films are, in a way, because Umar Ali Khan is a cinephile, he knows what he's doing. This film is partly an adaptation of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's also conversant with several George Romero zombie films. He's also a cult enthusiast, so he runs a website called hotspotcafe.org, where he writes reviews of very obscure, very bad films, and kind of in a celebratory way. So he knows what he's doing, and yet sort of he's trying to make a comment on genre as well, how genre is, how we can think of or theorize genre, keeping Pakistani films in mind, because this is a film that completely revises the slasher film template from a gender and a class perspective. Because usually your, what's his name, Leatherface, all the basic, the blueprint of a slasher film killer is a sexually frustrated male who is committing violence on the sexually active female body. Here we don't see any of that. Here you have a queer woman, this is a very an aggressive portrayal of what queer resistance might look like. And again, after murdering, the family eats, they're cannibals as well, so they eat their victims. So consuming the cishet urban body is something that I really got off on, and that's why I wrote the paper. So yeah.
Do you want to play
Any-
the trailer? Do you like to?
Sure.
पाकिस्तान की पहली एक्सट्रीम हॉरर फिल्म पाकिस्तान की पहली एक्सट्रीम हॉरर फिल्म
And all of this is very deliberate because he knows what he's doing. The filmmaker is not bad film. He deliberately mimics the exploitation filmmaking style of 70s American cinema. So this is very deliberate on his part. That the camera angles and it's supposed to be highly parodic as well, but yet simultaneously he's making a very interesting comment on sort of queer representation and again an interesting thing that this film does, because mostly American slasher films you have the killer who's sort of very gender ambiguous, but we still know that they're male, so even if they're cross-dressing it is a male body. But here baby is referred to as Beti. We see her transition and how the mother sort of supports her transition into a woman, and so that was basically my intervention to sort of read her character as a queer character, because previous readings have not really addressed that point, because this is what this film really actively addresses, that this is a queer woman and not a man dressing as a woman. So that's something that really I wanted to sort of add to the discourse, because not just that, her mother, and it's very interesting because normally, and I was thinking of Mola Jat as well, because when the mother, there is some sort of dishonor or violation, the mother is going to call out to the son, and the son then appears on horseback. Here, when she was in danger, she calls out, "Ah, meri beti," and then she appears with a mace and sort of kills the girl, Roxy. So that I thought was again very interesting. The fact that the film is very consciously addressing that this is a queer character. This is not a man dressing as a woman. This is a woman, a queer body behind the burqa. The burqa itself is queered with all that blood and all because cannibalism is also has been read as a very sort of there is a sexualized, eroticized sort of. It is a very erotic activity, really, and that has been read in the horror discourse. So yeah, that's I think all I can say about that research. If anybody else wants to make a comment on.
One thing that's very interesting about that is, first of all, if you haven't seen it, you have to see it. And it needs to become mandatory in every film class in Pakistan being taught, because it's a great film. I think one of the most interesting things is what you can connect through all these different genres is the idea of the body, and oftentimes either violence or some sort of something being imposed on the body, on the form, whether it is to hide it or whether to expose it, and that in itself is a very interesting thing that you can follow through different Pakistani cinemas over time, and it really comes out in this one. So if you haven't seen it, you should definitely see it.
I think something more, yeah, you mentioned
Yeah, so this is now the most written about film in Pakistani film history. There's like 3 full length, more than Mola Jab, which actually shows you how interesting it is. I think I'll say something about Umar Khan in a moment, so because I just sent him a WhatsApp message just in case he was in Lahore. He sent a message back, but he's not in Lahore. But before I just mention what he said, it's worth pointing out that this film, I think, has a strong intertextual quality, right? Which is what Iftikhar was talking about yesterday. I don't know if anyone came to that presentation here, but he was talking about the way that because of the kind of fragmented nature of the archive, the film archive in Pakistan, so many of these films seem to want to straddle the kind of gaps that are there and refer to previous films somehow. And there are sort of echoes of Mola Jard in this film as well, and references to it, and various other things I think in Pakistani cinema, which is an interesting thing. Zindan Lash as well, yeah, it's one of the Dracula film. Exactly.
That's also
Which I think is a film that Umar also was involved in restoring. So he basically said, he gave me a long list of, first of all he said thank you to everyone who's interested in his work, really very, very excited to know that we were talking about it. He sort of gave said it was a homage to all of these directors, and made a whole bunch of references which I won't go into now, cult directors. And one thing, 2 things he said that were interesting. One was that he came back from Heathrow Airport with 2 severed heads from eBay, and that was an interesting experience at customs. But the other thing he was saying is that my advice, to all the young aspiring filmmakers is to shun the aesthetic of multi-core productions of today, big budget productions. Go back to the 70s, go back to the 80s, low budget movies, where you will find amazing creativity. So I think that in itself is an interesting bit of advice, right? With that whole period which we talk about now as a wasteland, nothing interesting happened. He's saying actually think about doing low budget films. I want to open this out actually quite early. That's one advantage. We have quite a long session. Oh, I've not shown the clip. Let's show the clip. Okay, let's do that. Let's show the clip from Zindabad, and then we can open it out. Please start thinking about what kind of questions you might want to ask, what direction you want to take the conversation in after this. Which is a film Iftikhar talked about yesterday, right? That's what the paper was.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, we can open it up. No, we can actually just pause it. I can set it up as a conversation without showing.
Should we open up the conversation?
Yeah.
Okay, so, and also let's at some point try and loop back to that article you wrote on women filmmakers in new cinema. Maybe you can say about that, if just to give people hints of directions we might come back to in this eclectic discussion, but very rich one. Do we have any questions? Do we have any comments?
I do have a question from Momina, right? You were talking about cult genres and alternative cinemas, and you think this film, Ziba Khana, or any film made in Pakistan falls under the category of alternative cinema?
Do I think that if there's been a cult film made in Pakistan?
No, because I'm not sure the alternative cinema has been in Pakistan or not, because from what I think, alternative cinema movies are somehow like, Dictator, because there's a movie Dictator, because how they show violence in the form of comedy. So I think Pakistan has not been there yet, and they're just making, I don't think Pakistan has ever made an alternative cinema.
I think we sort of need to interrogate what we mean by alternative cinema. Cult films especially, again, as I think I said, cult can be a genre, but it can also be a legacy. So cult films don't need to be alternative films. They can be, Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge is a cult film. Right? Films that have a very long legacy, people go and watch it again and again and again and again, that they have unusual receptions. we identify cult films based on their reception. There are films that just don't die out. So they can be very mainstream films as well. For me, Maula Jatt is probably our truest cult film. That sort of result into a strange kind of a fandom around a film. So that is primarily how a cult film has been defined by theorists. But cult can also be a genre, so exploitation films that are low budget films. Low budget films that have, low production and bad acting, those kind of trash films or B films. Pakistan, post-70s, that is the form of cinema that emerged. We had B films. So,
just one more thing you said, cult gives us an opportunity to reimagine alternative cinema. I just didn't understand.
Can you repeat that?
Cult gives us an opportunity to reimagine alternative cinema.
Right. So the idea was that cult discourse sort of invites conversations on reception of how we view films and how we watched films. And the idea was that the existing discourse and the scholarship that exists on cult films in the West is very inadequate to imagine cult in Pakistan, because there is this idea of ironic spectatorship, that we are watching films ironically, the way American audiences watched American cult films, and that's how they became cult. So films like The Room or films of John Waters, these are all cult films, but because they were watched by 20-year-old bourgeois college boys who were trying to make fun of those films, and that's how they became so big. Here, we don't have that form of spectatorship. Here, people were watching Maula Jatt very sincerely, right? They weren't going to watch because it's a bad film. No, they knew it was very precarious to exist in the cinema, and yet they kept going. So that is what I meant, that the kind of work we need to do needs to re-theorize or reimagine how we can imagine cult in Pakistan.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I can just add to that also, I think the question of alternative cinema in Pakistan, it presumes a normative cinema, right? Or it presumes a hegemonically acceptable or kind of like a Hollywood style, right? A national cinema, which Pakistan really hasn't had for most of its film history. So, this goes back to the notion of Pakistan cinemas, right? Right now, there's a vibrant, burgeoning Balochi film production scene that's going on in the Gulf, right? And these films are all being distributed by YouTube, right? Siraiki telefilms, Pashto cinema for sure. I think all of these can be theorized as alternative cinemas.
But that gets big.
But then, with the caveat that there isn't really a hegemonic cinema at all, right?
Thank you. Further questions? Whose hand was up first? Who was up first?
So I think it was Gwen who talked about a friend who wouldn't go to the cinema or something. What was the psyche behind that? I couldn't understand. So what was the thinking behind that? Could you explain?
I didn't push her too much, but I've heard this from other women that I know, that it's just not really a decent space for women to occupy, right? There's something scandalous about going to the cinema. You have, in older cinemas like Lakshmi Chowk, right, you have the family box. And so there's this separate space set aside. But even then, kind of entering into that space of the cinema and just being in the public space, people, the other thing that I think I didn't mention earlier is that I have heard from, thousands of people about how terrible Pakistani cinema is, particularly the Punjabi films that I was looking at, right? And Punjabi films are all like this, and they're all just violent, and they're so vulgar, but I would say 95% of people who told me that had never even seen a Punjabi film, right? Or any Pakistani film. So I think the ideology around cinema as this, and maybe Punjabi cinema in particular, but I think this holds for Pashto cinema as well, right? As this very male working class pastime. So because there has been the rise in the multiplex, so that thing is changing now, and you hear, from older women who, were maybe college-going women before the era, it's also very class, this idea of of space, right? And so even when I was doing my field work, right, people told me that women don't go to see the cinema in luxury shop, right? But when I went there were women there. They were just working class women, right? And so it has to do, I think, just with that like sort of hegemonic middle class morality that says this is an appropriate space. But that discourse also, I don't know how much it necessarily reflects the lived reality of like every Pakistani middle class woman, but it's definitely there in a pretty big way.
Fascinating about reception, again, audience, is that we have said people, feeling embarrassed to see a certain film with someone. You're in the dark. It doesn't matter who's sitting next to you. But a scene comes on and people start squirming because they're really embarrassed to watch this in public. And exactly, it doesn't work as a family film. And that in itself is fascinating. But what is more, I think our idea of public space has shrunk so much that sharing a public experience in the public is almost, you can't see pleasure. You can't see a woman in pleasure. You can't see a relationship between two people regardless of their gender. You can't see a lot of things because we are just not used to experiencing emotions together in public anymore. And I think that makes people very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Worth pointing out that it's also, for men, it wasn't particularly okay, right, to go to the cinema. Yeah, I mean, not to mention the fact that cinemas are routinely blown up, right, in this country. Or were through the 2000s. When I was here, there were a good, maybe possibly a dozen cinemas blown up. And now, because the idea that cinema is an immoral thing, there's a sort of history there to that. Not to give a too general portrait, but it's a phenomenon here, that xenophobic strand. Okay. Say more about that.
No, Iqbal has a poem on cinema where it's very much compares it to idol worship.
There's a new piece by Timothy Cooper that reminds me, and he actually says, but Maulana Maududi, oddly enough, said cinema is permissible. So there's a whole book to be written on the complexity of Islamic responses to cinema in Pakistan. There are some more questions. Let's give it.
Assalamualaikum. My question is primarily for Professor Kirk, but anyone's open to answer it. आप बात की थी about Punjabi cinema, and I wanted to know more about the financial implications of alternative cinema. कि Avenue Studios पे जो films बन रही हैं वो कितनी की बन रही हैं, ticket कितने का बिक रहा है, कि working class people are going to see it. So that process of creation and then earning that money back, how is that working?
Okay, so full disclosure, I haven't been there in a few years, so I'm not sure I can give you an accurate. And this is also something that Zebunis and I have talked about extensively, is how much the digital revolution has impacted film here. So when I started my field work in 2013, the film that I worked on, that I kind of did an ethnographic research, participant observation research on, it was made by a quite established director, Parvez Rana, who since passed away. It starred Sean and Saima, and it had Shafkat Chima was and Nair Reja, so big, well-known actors and cast and veteran crew. That film was made for about 60 lakh. So at that time, about a third of that budget went just to purchasing the film stock, the 35mm film stock. It was shot on 35mm and I have a very short piece about this in Screen, but one day the cameraman, I was kind of watching him unload and asking him questions about the camera, and this one particular guy had been working in the film industry since the early 70s, and he said, he said it very proudly, he said, "Ye Angrezon ke zamane ka camera hai." And I thought he was maybe cracking a joke or exaggerating or something. But I had taken a lot of photos of the camera, and I went and I looked it up, and this particular model of camera started production in 1946. So this was the kind of technological infrastructure that was still being used in 2013 to film. So the way the film that I worked on also got delayed significantly. The shooting was delayed because I don't know if any of you know the Shabistan cinema in Lakshmi 35mm film. And so this, basically the digital revolution meant that a lot of films that had been shot and completed in Evernew Studios, in Body Studios, in that kind of traditional cinema, quote unquote, industry, they've been completed, but they're sitting there unfinished because the theaters no longer have the infrastructure to actually release them. And the way the film financing traditionally worked is that the producers would coordinate directly with the theaters and sell the film in advance, use that money to make the film, and then display it and then share the profits or whatever, split the profits. So the digitization of cinema has disrupted that particular film industry, but, and actually I have a clip of this, so maybe Haris, could we watch like 2 minutes? Is that okay, Ellie? But now, so, and this is why we have to think of cinemas in the plural. So on the one hand you have the New Pakistani cinema, which has worked on extensively and can talk a lot about. But recently, I found that some filmmakers from that kind of traditional, and particularly with familial links to the traditional film industry of Lahore, have started making digital films, but they look very different than the New Pakistani cinema films as well. We could just watch like 2 minutes of this girl is in trouble. The hero. So when I was doing my field work, I would constantly ask the directors. I could sense there was a lot of insecurity going around about this digital thing, and because most of the people working in that industry didn't have access to that equipment, which is very expensive. They didn't have access to training. They didn't have sort of the technical resources, right, to do this kind of production. So I would ask them, and many people told me, you can't actually make a Punjabi film on a digital camera. It's not possible. They would say like, well, nahi ban sakti, basically, digital based. So, the directors who I talked to would say, I'm going to make a movie on a digital camera. I'm going to make a movie on a red or on whatever. They said digital pe ban nahi sakti. Well, that's a different discourse. They had a lot of negative things to say about digital cinema and New Pakistani cinema in general, but 5 years down the road or 6 years down the road, they are doing this, and the market now for most of these films is not in Lakshmi Chowk. Actually, it's YouTube. So it's kind of shifting as well. The space of reception, the terrain of reception is really changing. But it's also not just because they're using a digital camera. I still wouldn't place this in with the New Pakistani cinema. Yeah.
YouTube, how do they make their money back?
Yeah.
advertise on their
Yes.
you know, they carry on in different spaces.
And I think they are releasing in some cinemas, but not the multiplexes. Yeah, this is not coming out. So until the Punjabi movies got banned, or until Indian movies got banned again, unofficially, Indian Punjabi movies were showing in multiplexes, but never Pakistani Punjabi movies, right? So I think these may be playing. I know these are playing on some single screen cinemas, but I would imagine that a lot of their revenue is also coming from YouTube, from DVD sales, right? Especially outside of Lahore, in rural Punjab, DVD stores are still, and USB sales. Yeah.
Pay a certain amount of money at the now no longer connect DVDs. So they take the USB, they whatever, get the movie transfer onto and then go on their phone.
And the filmmakers upload it to YouTube precisely because they know it's going to spread by USB anyway. So they want to have it out there.
But also the question of money and film.
That's a very, when you say how do they make money, filmmakers in general, until you get to the big blockbusters, they're not really making a lot of money on this. This idea of hit or flop, what makes money, what doesn't make money. We have a lot of students who've made a lot of films, they're all on YouTube and they haven't made any money from it. Which is probably why their parents are terrified, what's going to happen to them, and why we are encouraging them to continue doing that. Because eventually, the whole idea is someone big sees your film, and someone starts giving money to you, and someone's, it's all about people watching you. The more people, it's all about exposure. And reception now is so different, because reception is YouTube it's a streaming, it's on your phone. The biggest issue now in the film industry, even in the US, in Hollywood, is how to make a film in such a way that you can watch it on your phone, right? So it's just about not just about a vertical viewing. So when you turn it, what impact does that have? And they have people who are hired just to sit there and figure out if this person wants to watch my film on their phone when they turn it, what's going to happen? So these are questions that, as technology changes, it's going to have an effect on everybody.
My question is that, as we talked about linguistic violence, that we see in the cinema history that all around the world, we witness this physical violence, but in our regional cinema, like Punjabi cinema and Pashto cinema, we also witness this linguistic and verbal violence, which has, to my understanding, it has a lot of negative, I would say, effect on the audience, but the uneducated audience. But if let's say to remove this aspect of verbal or linguistic violence, if we remove it for the sake of this removing this negative aspect or this negative effect on the audience, so what will be the effect of that? Like if you remove this linguistic violence or verbal violence, what will be the effect later?
Can I ask, just when you say linguistic violence, do you mean like the verbal dueling, like and Nuri not shouting at each other?
The dialogue and shouting. Almost every dialogue in the movie.
So, to my mind, I don't see this as a negative thing. I'm sorry. I see this as kind of a moment of creativity, a moment of reappropriation of power. So I am not pro films getting rid of these dialogues, because I think they're a really important part of the genre, and I think in many ways they lie at the heart of the narrative and of the kind of ideologies that exist within these films. So I don't think they necessarily, and I haven't heard anybody necessarily proposing that they be removed. I think in a way, if we think about linguistic violence in another way, that there are hierarchies of language here, and that those hierarchies of language are tied to things like class, things like urban versus rural identities. So, to my mind, the way Punjabi films are kind of shoeboxed into, people tend to think of them in a very narrow way, and there's actually a lot of variety within Punjabi cinema. So people think Punjabi cinema and they see Mola Jat, or they think of perhaps this, but there's actually a lot more going on in Punjabi cinema. People just don't tend to watch it, and I'm sure the same is true for Pashto cinema, that there are assumptions made. So, in my mind, that's more of a linguistic violence to be concerned about. Does that make sense?
You keep, I know this from my own sensibilities, you keep talking about people not wanting to watch these films. Why do you think is it off-putting? Is it because we see these posters which display, well, they're quite misogynistic, some of these posters, and they display aspects of that, and the language and the music, what is it, that kind of sound that this gentleman here was talking about? There's a kind of loudness in all these films.
Well, the people who don't want to watch these films, there are lots of people who want to watch these films, is my point, and I think this is something, that Momina can really speak to as well. Lots of people do watch and love these films. The people who want to disavow them are the bourgeois, right? So, and that has to do a lot with ideas about Punjabi, right? Even the very fact of the language, kind of says something, let's say, even the fact of a film being in Punjabi kind of knocks it down a notch, right, in a lot of people's estimation. I see posters like these, and these are both for Pashto films, actually, by the way. But if you want to talk about misogyny in film, like, Hindi films are extremely misogynist by and large. Hollywood films are extremely misogynist by and large, right? So I don't think that's really, I think people tend to make that an excuse, right? They say it's vulgar. Well, all these same people are watching Sex and the City, right? Or they say it's not realistic. That's the biggest critique that you get of this kind of cinema. It's not realistic. Well, show me a cinema that is. The same people are watching Star Wars, they're watching The Matrix, right? So when you strip all of that away, what you're left with is language and class. So, and I'm a linguistic anthropologist, so maybe that's why that's my main metric for understanding this, and maybe Momina would probably add some other dimensions to it, but for me, those are kind of the main features, right? This is why my mother in the United States won't watch WWE, right? Because it's wrestling, and that's a low class thing to watch, and it's trashy, right? It's the idea of trash. You want to?
Yeah, I think my research focuses more on people who are watching and who would like to watch, because I know already why we don't watch, because this has been my upbringing, and we had two cinemas in Sialkot back to back, and you'd sort of as you're traveling there, you see these huge posters, and we were told not to look at them, and we would still look at them because for us they were really, really amazing to see this kind of art. And the idea is, well, who are the people who are still sneaking in despite all the moral concerns? There's this piece, and I can't remember her name, but she was working on trans women, and this line in an article where this particular trans woman that she's interviewing, she says that she had Sultan Rahi posters all up in her room. And for me and that's where the sentence ended. And I want to open that sentence. Well, you have trans women who are fangirling after Sultan Rahi. Where is that research? Right? That is kind of something that I'm interested in. Who are people who are still watching, who still go to the cinema, and who still, because I don't think we can just say because they're misogynistic, we don't want to watch them. I think so much of media that we consume is misogynistic. Game of Thrones. So much of stuff that we watch, I think it ends up being a class issue and politics of respectability. This is not a respectable kind of cinema to be watching. You pack these same messages in a more sort of mainstream, high budget garb, and there will be no issues. So I think again, what Gwen has said, I really think it's a class issue. When my research sort of focuses on not the cinephobia aspect, but cinephilia, who are still watching these films sincerely and enjoying it, and not just male audiences, but also female and queer women who are consuming texts like these. What does that tell us, right? I think that's all I can say.
So if I'm not mistaken, I got the impression that you feel that genre theory from a traditional Western perspective is limiting in understanding our cinema. But I read a couple of really great readings of My Pure Land as conversant with the tradition of the Western, and I was wondering if you felt that sort of discourse was somehow limiting in understanding the film?
It is. I think I've read several pieces calling these Punjabi action films spaghetti westerns or Pakistani westerns, and I feel sure. I mean, you're basically what you're trying to do is trying to make this kind of cinema legible to a Western audience, and I don't really believe in legibility. Like, why not just call them for what they are? Because we have local discourses and local audiences who talk about films in their own language, and I think introducing that would be a better contribution than just saying, oh, this is close to that Western film or genre that you know of, just to make it legible to a Western audience. So I do find it limiting because, and most of the times the logics of that particular genre don't really neatly apply anyway. So unless it's a direct conscious adaptation, even then, like Zivahana was an adaptation, but still it completely revises the slasher film template. You have a film, sure.
I was thinking this is reminding me of Sivanis's argument, right? Because people tend to say new Pakistani cinema, right?
Well,
It's like Bollywood, right? Oh, this is just like an Indian version.
No, but I think that there's a difference. I think I always break it to a sweat when I'm writing any paper and like have it published and have academics read it. I'm okay with a non-academic reading it because new Pakistani cinema is exactly how what you're saying about Punjabi cinema is how academics talk about new Pakistani cinema. It's horrible. It's it's a copy of Bollywood. It's trying to be something it's not. It's just about big productions and money and all of that. And it's very difficult to write about that kind of stuff because I am on the bad side as far as that's. I'm defending the bad guy or writing about the bad guy in Pakistani academia, but I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think. Yeah, as Bollywood or but what's wrong? I also don't know what's wrong with that. I mean, Pakistani and Indian cinema have the same history. So if there is something that they have in common, I don't understand what's wrong with that. Why do we have to make our own cinema? But that means that you're saying that the cinema that came before 47 is not our cinema. And then again, that comes back to this idea of rejecting anything that's come before a particular time or anything came before, like whatever was being made in the Urdu cinema of Dhaka. So I think that this idea of rejecting and not owning something and saying why is everything like Bollywood? Well, I'm surprised it's not more like Bollywood, to be honest. That's our tradition. It's not the Indian tradition, it's a South Asian tradition, and that's where it's come from. What happens now, which direction we go in now, that is completely different. That's for what young filmmakers today will make. But how is that any different from the films of the 1950s or 60s? Yakkewali is very much in that tradition as well.
One last question. We're right on the end of our session, but if that's all right with everyone.
So my question is about the representation of item songs in Pakistani movies before and after. Who do you think is the target audience for them?
We all are, because we all enjoy them. Well, the item numbers is a very, very difficult thing to really talk about it in 30 seconds. But when you think about the item number, you also have to think about the gaze, which becomes a very important thing. And there's three, the idea of the actual screen, the camera, and the audience in the cinema, and the audience on screen. So you have so many different layers of perception and who watches item numbers. But also this idea of how item numbers are written about, again, in a way that's seen negatively. It's like the idea of what's the purpose of an item number, and the fact that, would you consider that an item number? The Yakkewali song we started?
Yeah, that's the point. Because you just said that such type of songs, you don't want to see them because they're worth it. But then on the other hand,
No, I didn't say that about that, but that song from Yakkewali, would you consider that an item number because she was fully dressed? Why would you consider that an item number?
I think item songs are basically those songs which have no narrative related to the plot of the movie.
What?
So I think that had something related to the movie, so I would
So entertainment, if for example, if you have all of you seen Naam Wala Mafraad? You know that song, Believe, the song when they run away. What did that play a role?
No, it didn't. I think that was the item song.
Okay, so but if somebody said, well, that plays the role of entertainment. Like you're saying, yes, we're talking about role in the narrative, yes, but we're talking about then therefore saying that things only have one role. So if you have to think about why some things there and how some things there, and what someone is wearing. When a man dances, we call it item number, right? So if we are placing item number definition on a gender definition where it's a woman who is exposed, scantily clad, and entertaining men, and that is item number only, then okay. But there's so many, we can go so much deeper into that as well.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, right, we just had Lalita Gopathan here, who has done a lot of work on South Asian cinema as a cinema of interruptions, right? That's her big metric. So not necessarily understanding that as a bad thing. That's a very kind of, let's say, Hollywood hegemonic centric idea that everything in the film has to serve the plot in this particular way.
When I
Right?
read a short film, it's a film from it's a short film. It was like 6 minutes long. It's a taken from Lamps to
Can you speak in the mic?
Gwen and I are going to work on a short film on taking a Kareem from Lums to NCA. We may have an item number in that. We are going to put an item number in that. In fact, 30 seconds of an item number in a 5-minute film.
Or can we have like 4 minutes of everything?
4 minutes of item number and 1 minute of the drive from NCA to Lums.
Looking forward to it.
So, if Taharab may want to say something about the next session, before he does that, just want to thank you all for